I bought this pullover so that I would have something to wear to the Barbie movie, and I actually quite like it. I don't wear a lot of pastels, but maybe I should. Hi, YouTube. My name is Jack, and today we're going to talk about conservatism, I guess? Conservatism and autonomy and community, and sort of the constellation of concepts that comes around those things, and how they interact with each other in the context of traditional Wicca. Mm. This one's gonna piss off some people in Florida, but everything I say pisses off people in Florida, so here we go. Um, I talk quite a lot about Wicca and Gardnerian Wicca specifically, and I do that in a fairly public way. And as a result, I think people tend to get a certain impression of, I don't know, what my attitudes are around things in the tradition, right? I talk a lot about the amount of variation that there is in Gardnerian Wicca, um, not just you know, like in America versus in the UK. I have a video for that. I'll link it up above. But also things like gender roles and the kinds of variation that do exist in Wiccan covens with regard to gender roles and the kinds of variation that might exist in Wiccan covens with regard to gender roles. And I try, I think, to be very frank about the amount of diversity of practice and theology that we encounter in Wiccan communities, because this is something that, particularly from the outside, can be quite opaque, and it can be really unclear as an outsider how wide-ranging the differences are from one coven to another. And even as an insider, depending on the portions of the community that you're exposed to, if you are a Gardnerian initiate, but all of the other Gardnerian initiates you know are members of the same subline as you, if you all have the same lineage, you are likely all to have very similar ways of practicing. And there are lots of things that, if you haven't been exposed to covens doing things differently in another part of the world or in another lineage, you might not even be aware are done differently or could be done differently. So I try, when I talk about Gardnerian Wicca in public, to be really open about the diversity that you encounter in the tradition. But I think that sometimes that ends up giving the impression that I have a very liberal attitude about what I enjoy in ritual, or that I am maybe more experimental or more freeform than I actually am, or just that, like, I don't know. I think certainly there are some people who don't like me by and large, but there are some people who get the impression that I want to say anything goes in Gardnerian Wicca. Um, And part of that is, if you pay really close and careful attention to the information that I put out there, the opinions that I put out there about Wicca, I don't ever actually go into specifics. I don't talk about the details of things that happen in Wiccan ritual or ways that things are done. And sometimes I might refer to, sort of broadly speaking, like, you know, arguments that people are trying to instigate over the inclusion of transgender people in the craft. Or I might refer to, in broad terms, like certain rituals at which it is politically important that things be done by the book or whatever. But I don't like to talk about the details of Gardnerian ritual, Gardnerian practice. I like to keep my cards pretty close to chest on that one, and my own personal understanding of my oath of secrecy is such that there's a lot that I'm just not comfortable talking about. Stuff that lots of other people are perfectly willing to talk about. But, like, there's a lot of stuff that I just... Not even that I think it's secret, it's just that I don't think it's anyone's business who's not in the Gardnerian community. So I don't talk in real concrete examples a lot of the time, and I certainly don't talk about my specific tastes in Gardnerian ritual, in Gardnerian practice, because I can't give examples on those things. And I think that the fact that I don't talk about my tastes or my preferences sometimes gives the impression that I don't have those tastes or preferences, which is very much not true. I have strong opinions about what I like in Gardnerian ritual. And I think for a lot of people who know me from my, people in the Gardnerian community who know me from my videos or from my books, or my blog or any other online presence I might have, who see the way that I talk really openly about the amount of variation that there is in Gardnerian practice, I think people are sometimes surprised by how strong my opinions are and how stodgy a lot of my preferences are. People who knew me sort of like before I kicked off the YouTube channel are not surprised by this. Anyone who knows me in real life knows this about me, but like I have uh, I hate the word conservative because I think it carries with it a particular kind of um, like jostling for legitimacy. I think when people say that they have conservative views about something, they're implicitly casting that in opposition to like radical progressive views about something. And there's this idea that like, I want to hold on to the real true thing, and those people over there are changing things and introducing variation. So like, that's not at all what I mean. But my taste in ritual is, in the Gardnerian tradition, is first off incredibly minimalistic. I like ritual that is stripped to the bones. And a lot of the flourishes and embellishments that you'll find in every coven, because every coven has them, a lot of the time those flourishes are not to my personal taste because I like minimal set dressing in ritual. That's just a matter of personal taste. That's not a matter of legitimacy or anything, right? That's just a matter of like what I get the most out of in ritual is when it's really stripped down. There are lots of other people who like ritual that's really lavish and elaborate and built up with high drama and so on. But so my taste in ritual is very uh, minimalistic in a way that I think surprises quite a lot of people. And B, there are certain things, which I'm not going to get into the specifics of, but there are certain things where my taste in ritual is very much like I am of the Long Island line of Gardnerian Wicca. And there are certain things on which my taste in ritual is very identifiably sort of like the old school Long Island line way of thinking about and doing things. And some of those things refer to like who's involved in initiations in what ways. Some of those things refer to like the construction of sort of like the basic ritual framework. But there are certain ways in which, in the wider Gardnerian community, I have tastes that are very identifiably American Long Island line of sort of an old school conservative sort. And conservative here doesn't mean original or more true or like more accurately Gardnerian, because these are tastes that are pretty specific to my lineage, the Long Island lineage, and that you're not going to find, for example, in European Gardnerian communities. But there are certain ways in which I like hold on to some of the received practices and tastes and so on of my lineage. And I like those things, and I'm not interested in doing ritual differently. I have strong tastes in what I like in ritual, how I like ritual done, what I get the most out of, and a lot of the time I think people can be surprised by how hardline and old school my tastes are, given how publicly I talk about the importance of diversity in the Gardnerian community and sort of the wide range of practices that we in Wicca have. But here's the thing. having strong ritual tastes applies to myself and no further. Well, I mean, it applies to myself and then to the coven that I belong to, insofar as that's the group that I'm doing ritual with, and that's the group where, like, my opinions might matter. I'm not the high priestess of the coven, so my opinions are not the final word on anything, and I can express a taste for something and have the coven still end up doing something differently, right? Part of the point of traditional Wicca is that you're involved in a community, and you're not always having things exactly your own way. But, like, my tastes matter up to a certain point in my solitary practice and in my coven. They don't matter beyond that. So even though I have very strong opinions about what I like in Gardnerian ritual, those opinions are only about what I like. And I truly, madly, deeply just don't care what other people are doing in their covens, because I'm not in those covens and it doesn't affect me. Like, it just doesn't. It doesn't affect me. There are lots of people all over the world, Gardnerians, Alexandrians, who do things in ritual that I probably would not enjoy. But I'm not in those rituals, so it doesn't matter whether I would enjoy them, whether I would get the most out of them, whether I would like them, or whether they sort of meet the sniff test of, like, what I think is appropriate to the Gardnerian tradition, or whatever, right? Like, there are so many covens, countless covens all over the world, that do things that are in some way or another orthogonal to my own understanding of the central mysteries of Wicca. There are lots of covens that do things in a way that does not give expression to something I consider essential to Wicca, or that places really strong emphasis on something that I consider either marginal or not a part of Wicca at all. There are lots and lots of covens that do lots of things so differently, and a lot of those covens do things in a way that would not be to my taste. But I'm not in those covens. The principle that I'm dancing around here is coven autonomy. Wicca is a decentralized religion. There is no hierarchy beyond an individual coven. There is no central authority, and no one has any power over anyone outside of their own coven. No one has the right to decide how anyone is going to do things outside of their own coven. So even if, privately, I wouldn't want to do things a certain way, it doesn't touch me if other covens decide that they do want to do things that way. And that is the root of the sort of liberal attitude that I really try to push to the fore in everything I talk about with Wicca publicly. Because there's a really strong and important difference between individual personal taste in ritual and recognition of the autonomy of other covens and their right to do things the way that works for them. Now, probably in the American Gardnerian community in particular, but then, like, more broadly in traditional Wiccan communities, things sometimes get a little thorny if you start thinking about, like, initiations, if you start thinking about variations that go sort of so far beyond what is common or widespread or shared or understood, right? Like, so if you have a coven that, like, stops doing magic and stops performing initiations and stops worshipping gods and just throws out everything that every other coven does and just does something completely radically different. Like, there is kind of this latent metaphysical question of whether those people are still practicing Wicca. And, like, that metaphysical question does hang in the background. But by and large, it's not my business. It's not my business. And I think people, especially when it comes to the variations that exist in, like, the ways that some covens do pieces of initiations or whatever, I think people get very hung up on this metaphysical question of, like, well, you know, like, does it count? Does it count as being the same thing? And ultimately, I think despite my own personal tastes in how I like to do things, I will always fall down on the side of those other people over there can do what they like. And I think that people don't always realize, people on the outside, but even people on the inside, people, in certain Wiccan communities, don't always realize that those two things can coexist. That you can, in your own practice, be pretty hardline about doing things the way you were trained in your lineage. And also just being totally okay with other people, with other lineages or other covens or whatever, deciding that they want to do things a different way. Like, those two things can coexist with no conflict whatsoever. And some of this has to do with some, like, American Gardnerian history that is not really anyone's business outside of the tradition. There are just, like, political squabbles that have happened over the course of decades, and none of it really matters. But I think the American Gardnerian community has fallen into, and less so maybe recently, but certainly, like, for the last couple decades of the 20th century up through the start of the 21st century, the American Gardnerian community existed in a space where I think a lot of people were really concerned with this negative question of, like, how can I tell who is not one of us? How can I tell who is doing something that's so different that they don't count as us? How can I tell who is an outsider so that I know where to build the fences around my community? And that question maybe in some cases deserves to be asked. It is a difficult metaphysical question on which I think there are reasonable ways that people can disagree. But there is a second question, and I think a much more important question, that we don't ask as often or as loudly. And that is, how can I coexist with people who are in this community with me, but who are doing things differently from me, and maybe even doing things that I don't like, don't approve of, wouldn't do myself? How do I coexist with people who I dislike personally? Like, maybe I think you're an asshole, but we're still in this community together, and we need to find a way to be able to exist in community. So, even though there are lots of covens that do lots of things that I would never consider doing, and in some cases, even that do things that I feel maybe, like, miss out on something that is so deeply fundamental to my own experience of Wicca, that I would never consider doing things that way because I feel like it would miss out on this, like, key element of whatever. It is my responsibility to be able to coexist with people who have different experiences than my own. And the mysteries of Wicca are fundamentally experiential. Wicca is a religion focused on personal, direct communion with the divine in a way that means your experiences are going to be radically different from mine. And it's my job to be able to make space for that. And I think we sometimes lose sight of that question. So, now, that said, like, there are obviously cases in which you don't want to be coexisting with people, people who are dangerously violent, people who are just, like, bigots, right? So there are lots of people who don't want queer people, and more specifically trans people, in the craft. Those people are shitty and they're assholes. They are Gardnerians. I mean, there are probably also non-Gardnerians who feel that way, but, like, there are Gardnerians who feel that way, and to a certain extent, they exist in this community, and we have to find a way to, like, like, they get to go be shitty on their own time. That doesn't mean that I have to allow bigotry into my own spaces. That doesn't mean that I have to, like, play nice with them or, go to rituals with them or anything like that. But I think that, like, they still count as Gardnerian. And, like, you gotta live with that. And similarly, with people who are, I don't know, maybe not bigoted, maybe not like politically shitty or like violent or, you know, harming marginalized groups or anything like that, but who are just doing ritual in a way that I don't like, they're still Gardnerian, and it's not my business what they do because I'm not in their coven. Um, so I think just like the ability to recognize that a community is made up of people who have their own experiences, who do things differently, and that you can have individual tastes, you can have personal opinions about what you like in ritual and in practice, but that those opinions don't have to interfere with your ability to exist in community with other people, barring situations where people are dangerous or violent or bigoted or whatever. You know, I think that's important. So, I've been rambling here. I'm gonna wind this up and rewatch the video and see if it's coherent, but thank you for watching, and I will talk to you sometime soon. Goodbye.